The sun was falling behind the grain towers of New Verdana when the shadows came from the sky. Mara Okafor Singh was 7 years old, and she was exactly where she was not supposed to be, outside the colony perimeter. Crouched in the red dirt, with a plastic jar in one hand and a small shovel in the other, collecting soil samples for her school project on alien microbes. Beside her sat Sergeant, a honey badger who weighed 14 kilograms and feared absolutely nothing in the known universe. Sergeant, Sarge as Mara called him, was part of the Terran Buyer Companion program, a project that gave certain Earth animals enhanced thinking, tougher bodies, and a small translator collar that turned their sounds into rough words that humans could understand. The program had produced loyal dogs, clever ravens, and calm horses that helped colonists on dozens of worlds. And then there was Sarge. Sarge had bitten 3 veterinarians, destroyed 2 containment fields, units, and escaped his transport crate 11 times before the program decided that the only way to manage him was to bond him with someone he actually liked. That someone was Mara. She had walked into the bonding center at age 4, sat down next to the angriest animal on the planet, and offered him half of her sandwich. Sarge had eaten the sandwich and then sat in her lap and growled at anyone who came close. They had been together every day since. Now Mara held up a jar of reddish soil to the fading light and said, "This one smells different, Sarge. I think there are new things growing in it." Sarge sniffed the jar and made a sound that his collar translated as dirt, which was his opinion on most things that were not food or enemies. Mara laughed, and that was the last easy sound she would make for a long time. The Vithari dropship came down through the clouds like a blade falling through water, silent, black, and fast. Were a species that the rest of the galaxy called the Prime Hunters. 8-foot-tall creatures that looked like armored reptiles built on the bodies of centaurs, with 4 powerful legs, 2 upper arms ending in clawed hands, infrared pits along their skulls that could see heat in total darkness, and venomous spurs on their forelimbs that could paralyze a creature 5 times their size in seconds. They had conquered 14 worlds, and they believed with absolute certainty that the universe was a hunting ground, and they were its greatest hunters. Their culture was built on a single idea called the Great Hunt, the belief that all species existed on a scale from predator to prey, and that the Vethari sat at the very top. They collected trophies from the species they considered beneath them, and they kept these trophies alive in a place called the Hall of Conquered Meek, aboard their warship, the Fang Eternal. Humans were new to the galaxy, and the Vethari had studied them from a distance and decided they were not impressive. No claws, no armor, no venom, no natural weapons of any kind. Slow to mature, easy to break. The classification was simple: Meek Class Opportunistic Omnivore. And now Hunt Captain Kravik Dahl wanted a specimen for his collection. The dropship landed 200 meters from Mara, and the hatch opened, and 6 Vethari hunters moved across the ground faster than anything that large had any right to move. Mara saw them and froze, not from fear, but from the simple shock of seeing something that big appearing from nowhere. Sarge did not freeze. Sarge saw the hunters, and every hair on his body stood up, and a sound came from deep inside his chest, not a growl, not a hiss, but something older and more terrible, the sound of an animal that had spent 60 million years on a planet where everything was trying to kill everything else, and had decided that the correct response was to be angrier than all of. The lead hunter reached for Mara with one massive clawed hand. Sarge hit him in the forearm like a furry cannonball, teeth sinking through the gap in the hunter's wrist armor, and the hunter screamed in a frequency that Mara had never heard before, the sound of a predator discovering that it was bleeding. The other hunters reacted fast, and one of them kicked Sarge across the dirt, and another shot him with a stun pulse that was designed to drop creatures 10 times his mass. Sarge tumbled, hit the ground, lay still for 2 seconds, and then got back up. He charged again, This time a hunter caught him with a venomous spur, a strike that should have locked every muscle in his body into paralysis within heartbeats. Sarge bit the spur, ripped it sideways, and kept fighting. Kravik watched from the dropship ramp, and felt something he did not bother to name, a small flicker of surprise at the tiny creature's refusal to stop. A hunter of 100 campaigns, and he did not waste time on curiosities. "Take the child," he ordered. "Leave the animal, it is nothing." This was his first mistake, and it would not be his last. They grabbed Mara, and she fought, kicking, biting, scratching. And for one moment, Kravik thought that perhaps these soft creatures had slightly more fire than their classification suggested. But he dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. A hunter struck Sarge one final time, a heavy blow that cracked bones and sent the badger rolling into the dirt. And then the dropship sealed and lifted into the darkening sky. And Mara was gone. Sarge lay in the red soil and bled. His skull was fractured, and 3 of his ribs were cracked, and there were cuts across nearly half his body. And the venom from the spur was working through his blood, trying to shut him down. Any other creature in the galaxy would have stayed down. Sarge stood up, himself, once, and turned toward the colony. There was an emergency beacon inside the colony's communication building, a simple device that sent a distress signal to any Terran Defense Force ship within range. Sarge could not operate the beacon because he was a honey badger, and honey badgers did not have the patience for buttons and switches. So he did what honey badgers do. He broke into the communications building through a ventilation duct, knocked over every piece of equipment he could reach, tore apart 2 control panels with his claws, and then sat on top of the emergency beacon console and screamed at it until the noise and the destruction brought the colony militia running. They found him sitting in the wreckage, bleeding from his head, growling at anyone who came close. The beacon was active. Somewhere out in the dark between the stars, a Terran Defense Force patrol ship called the Reclamation received the signal and changed course. In a cage, aboard the Fang Eternal, a 7-year-old girl sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her hands still dirty from collecting soil samples, her eyes dry and sharp, and already watching the guards who passed her cell. Mara was afraid, but Mara was also her mother's daughter, and her mother had always told her the same thing. When you are scared, you watch and you learn and you wait. So Mara watched. And far behind her, on a world that was already getting smaller in the stars, a 14-kilogram honey badger with a cracked skull and a broken body refused to stop moving and refused to stop fighting and refused to understand that he was supposed to be beaten. Because that was the thing about honey badgers that the galaxy had not yet learned. They did not know how to quit, and they did not know how to leave their people behind. The Fang Eternal was not just a warship. It was a cathedral built to celebrate killing. Its corridors were lined with the bones and hides and preserved bodies of creatures from across the galaxy, mounted on walls and displayed behind glass like prizes at a fair. Except the fair was death, and the prizes had once been alive and afraid. The trophy hall sat in the center of the ship, a vast round chamber with a ceiling so high it vanished into shadow, and inside it stood rows of transparent cages arranged in a circle, like an audience forced to watch its own captivity. Some of the cages held living creatures, a trembling 6-legged herbivore from a jungle world, a winged thing the color of silver that pressed itself against the back of its cage and would not move, a massive Drelmathi herd beast with sad wet eyes that stood twice Mara's height and breathed in slow, heavy sighs. Some of the cages held things that were no longer alive, but had been preserved so perfectly they looked like they might blink at any moment. Mara was placed in a cage at the center of the circle, in the position of honor, which meant the position where every visitor to the hall could see her. She sat down on the cold floor, crossed her legs, put her hands on her knees, and looked around. She did not cry. This was not because Mara was not scared. She was deeply and terribly scared, in the way that only a child taken from everything she knows can be. But Mara had learned something from living with Sarge for 3 years. That fear was just a feeling, and feelings did not have to control what you did next. So instead of crying, she began to study her cage. The lock was electronic, a flat panel set into the doorframe, with a symbol that glowed blue when it was sealed, and she guessed it would glow green when it was open. The walls were transparent and hard, some kind of material she could not scratch with her fingernails. Guards passed the trophy hall, on a rotation, and Mara counted the time between each pass. She used her own heartbeat as a clock, the way her mother had taught her, when they played hiding games in the brain fields. 240 heartbeats between each guard. She stored this number in her mind, the way she stored everything, quietly and carefully. On the second day, a young Vethari came to her cage with a tray of food. This was Tala, a sub-hunter who had joined the crew of the Fang Eternal only recently, and who had not yet earned the scars and honors that the older hunters wore on their armor like medals. Tala was smaller than the other Vethari, with scales that were a lighter shade of gray, and eyes that moved quickly and seemed to take in too much. Tala set the food tray in the slot at the base of the cage, and waited to see if the human child would eat. Mara looked at the food, some kind of protein block, and a container of water, and then looked up at Tala and said, "Thank you." Tala blinked all 4 eyelids at once, which was the Vethari expression for surprise. No specimen had ever thanked Tala before. "You speak Galactic Common," Tala said. "My school teaches it," Mara said. "We learn it so we can talk to other species when we grow up." "You will not grow up here," Tala said, and immediately regretted saying it, because the words were cruel, and Tala had not meant them to be cruel. Tala had meant them as a fact, but facts could be cruel too. Mara ate the protein block slowly, watching Tala's face. "What is this ship?" Mara asked. "The Fang Eternal, the greatest hunting vessel of the Vethari fleet," Tala said. "And all these creatures in these cages, you took them from their homes." "They were collected," Tala said, using the word the Vethari used instead of taken, because it sounded better. "They are specimens." "They are scared," Mara said simply, looked at the other cages, at the trembling herbivore, and the frozen silver creature, and the sad Drelmathi, and felt something shift uncomfortably in the space behind her ribs. "What is your name?" Mara asked. "Tala." "Tala, do you know what a honey badger is?" Tala did not. "You will," Mara said, and she smiled in a way that made Tala feel like the temperature in the room had changed. On the 3rd day, Kravik Dal came to observe his newest trophy. The hunt captain stood before Mara's cage, with his upper arms folded across his chest, and his infrared pits scanning her small body, mapping her heat, her heartbeat, the flow of blood through her veins. "It has not broken," he said to his second-in-command, a scarred hunter named Vorath. "The xenobiology files say human juveniles are emotionally fragile. This one shows no signs of distress." "Perhaps it is defective," Vorath suggested. "Perhaps," Kravik said, but he made a note in his personal log. "The human juvenile displays atypical composure," and this interested him more than he wanted to admit. He leaned close to the cage and said, "Do you understand where you are, small thing?" Mara looked at him, looked up at 8 feet of armored, venomous, apex predator, and said, "You took me from my home, and you put me in a cage, and you think I am weak because I am small and soft." Kravik tilted his great head. "I am not weak," Mara said. "I am just waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For my friend." Kravik made the Vethari sound that meant amusement, a low rumble from deep in his chest. "No one is coming for you, small thing. You are alone." Mara shook her head slowly and said, He is coming. He always comes, and he doesn't stop. Kravik walked away and dismissed the child's words as the desperate hope of a captured creature, because that was what prey did. They hoped, and then they broke. He was wrong about this, but he would not understand how wrong, for several more days. Far behind the Fang Eternal, across a stretch of cold black space, the Terran Defense Force patrol ship Reclamation was burning hard on an intercept course. Commander Josefa Mwangi stood on the bridge and studied the tactical display, and made calculations that did not add up in her favor. The Fang Eternal was a warship, with 200 hunters aboard, and weapons that could crack a small moon. The Reclamation was a patrol ship with a crew of 40, and weapons designed for pirates and smugglers, not apex predator dreadnoughts. A straight fight he'd last about 4 minutes, and none of those minutes would be good. But Mwangi had not survived 20 years in the Terran Defense Force by fighting fair. She called her Marine squad leader to the bridge and laid out a plan, a boarding action, fast and surgical, timed to hit the Fang Eternal during a scheduled engine cooldown cycle when its sensors would be running at reduced power. Small team, she said. Get in, get the girl, get out before they know what happened. The squad leader, a woman named Reyes with a jaw like a shovel and eyes that had seen too much, looked at the plan and nodded slowly, and then said, "And the animal," because Sarge was on the ship. Sarge had been brought aboard at New Verdana, and the medical team had treated his injuries as best they could, and then tried to put him in a recovery cage. And Sarge had destroyed the recovery cage, and then destroyed a second recovery cage, and then sat in the corridor outside the armory and refused to move. The ship's xenobiologist had scanned him and reported that the honey badger had 3 cracked ribs, a fractured skull plate, cuts across 40% of his body, and residual alien venom still circulating in his blood. His adrenal output was 4 times the normal level for his species. Maximum. He was fully alert and attempting to chew through the armory door in the general direction the Vethari ship had gone. The xenobiologist had asked Commander Mwangi if they should sedate him. Mwangi had looked at the honey badger. 14 kilograms of fury and damage and absolute unbreakable purpose, and she had said 2 words that would later become famous in Terran Defense Force history. Bring him. Reyes added Sarge to the boarding team roster. The Marines were not happy about this. Sarge did not care about their happiness. Sarge cared about exactly one thing in the universe, and that thing was in a cage on an alien warship, and every molecule of his small and terrible body was aimed at getting her back. The Reclamation flew on through the dark, and the distance between the 2 ships grew smaller with every hour. And in her cage aboard the Fang Eternal, Mara ate her food, and counted guard rotations, and quietly asked Tala questions about how the ship worked, and stored every answer in her memory like ammunition. Because Mara was 7 years old, and she could not fight a ship full of hunters. But she could learn, and she could wait. And she knew, with the certainty that only comes from loving something that has never once let you down, that somewhere behind her in the dark, something small and angry and covered in blood was coming to get her. And it would not stop until it did. 3 days into the Fang Eternal's journey home, Mara had become the most well-behaved specimen in the history of the Vethari Trophy Hall. She ate her food without complaint. She slept at regular hours. She spoke politely to Tala when Tala came to check on her, and she sat quietly in her cage with the patience of a creature 10 times her age. The Vethari guards barely looked at her anymore. This was exactly what Mara wanted. Because while the guards stopped watching, Mara had not stopped learning. She had memorized the full guard rotation, 240 heartbeats between each pass, a longer gap of 400 heartbeats during the shift change at what the Vethari called the deep dark hour. She had listened to the guards speak to each other and picked up 6 words of the Vethari language, including the words for open and door and down and quiet, and the word that seemed to mean harmless, which was the word they used when they talked. About her, She had asked Tala to explain how the cage lock worked. For my school project about alien technology, she had said, and she had said it with such wide-eyed, innocent curiosity that Tala had explained the entire mechanism without once considering that a 7-year-old might be memorizing the information for a different purpose. The lock was a magnetic seal controlled by a palm print reader keyed to Vethari biology. Mara could not open it with her own hands, but she now knew that it could be opened, and knowing a thing was possible was the first step toward making it happen. On the evening of the third day, Kravik Dal held a ceremonial dinner in the great hall of the ship, and he brought Mara's cage to the center of the room so that his 40 senior hunters could see his newest acquisition. Kravik stood before his officers in full ceremonial armor, his scales polished, his venomous spurs gleaming, and he spoke about the great hunt and the glory of the Vethari and the weakness of the species they had conquered. He pointed at Mara's cage and said, "Observe the human, a species with no claws, no armor, no venom, no speed. They are soft in body and fragile in spirit, and they are the gentlest prey the galaxy has offered us." 40 Vethari hunters made sounds of approval. Mara stood in her cage and looked at them. 40 armored predators, each one capable of killing her with a single blow, and she felt the fear rise up inside her like cold water filling a cup. But she did not let the cup overflow. She opened her mouth and spoke in broken Vethari, 6 words strung together with terrible grammar but perfect clarity. "My friend comes, he not stop." The hall went quiet for one breath, and then erupted in the deep rumbling sound of Vethari laughter. Kravik smiled with all of his teeth, which in a Vethari was not a friendly expression, but a display of dominance, and said, "What friend could a soft little thing like you possibly have that would concern a hunter?" Mara said nothing more because she had said what she needed to say, and she had learned from Sarge that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was stop talking and let the silence do the work. In the back of the hall, Tala did not laugh. After the dinner, Tala went to the ship's database and opened the xenobiology files on Earth and searched for the word that Mara had used days earlier, honey badger. Tala found the entry for Mellivora capensis. Tala read about an animal that weighed less than most Vethari hunting equipment, an animal that regularly attacked creatures many times its size, including large cats and venomous snakes, an animal whose skin was so thick and loose that it could be grabbed by a predator and twist inside its own hide to bite the attacker, an animal whose resistance to venom was so extreme that it could be bitten by a cobra and simply sleep it off, and then eat the cobra. At the bottom of the file there was a note added by a Terran military attaché. The note said, "Do not engage, not worth it, nothing is worth it." Tala closed the file and sat very still for a long time. Far behind the Fang Eternal, the Reclamation had found its moment. Commander Mwangi's crew had intercepted a Vethari communication buoy and decoded the Fang Eternal's engine maintenance schedule. And they knew that in exactly 6 hours, the great warship would drop to minimum power for a cooldown cycle. Sensors reduced, point defense systems offline, the entire ship running quiet and slow. Mwangi briefed the boarding team in the Reclamation's cargo bay. 4 Marines in light assault armor, 1 combat medic, and Sarge. The Marines stood in a line and checked their weapons, and tried to look like professionals who were not at all concerned about the fact that they were about to board a warship full of the galaxy's most dangerous predators, with a team of 5 humans and 1 very small, very angry animal. Sarge sat in the insertion pod and did not look concerned, because Sarge had never once in his life looked concerned about anything. Marine Sergeant Reyes looked at the honey badger and then at Mwangi, and said, "Commander, with respect, the animal is not trained for shipboard combat operations." Sarge turned his head and looked at Reyes, and his translator caller said one word, "Move." Reyes moved. The insertion pod launched during the cooldown cycle. A tiny metal shell fired from the Reclamation's underside, on a ballistic arc. No engines, no heat signature, just a cold, dark shape, falling toward the belly of the Fang Eternal, like a stone dropped into a pond. It hit the ventral maintenance hull with a soft magnetic clamp, and the Marines cut through the outer plating in 90 seconds, and they were inside. The ship was enormous and dark, and smelled like a place where things died. The Marines moved through maintenance tunnels and access corridors, following the route that Mwangi's intelligence team had mapped from the intercepted communications. Sarge followed for approximately 45 seconds. Then Sarge went his own way. He turned left, where the team turned right, and vanished into a ventilation duct that was barely wide enough for his body, and the Marines called after him in harsh whispers, and Sarge did not respond, because Sarge had never in his life responded to anyone telling him where to go. He moved through the ducts by smell, Mara's smell, a scent he knew better than his own, the smell of dirt and soap, and the particular warmth of a human child he had slept next to every night for 3 years. The ducts were not designed for creatures like Sarge, but that did not matter, because Sarge was not designed for anything. He was simply built by millions of years of evolution on a planet that did not care about design and only cared about survival. He squeezed through gaps that should have stopped him, and climbed vertical shafts that should have defeated him. And he moved through the guts of the Fang Eternal like a disease the ship did not know it had caught. In a service corridor on the ship's lower deck, Sarge found his first Vithari. The hunter was alone, performing a routine maintenance check on a power conduit. He was 8 feet tall and armored, and armed with a sidearm that could burn a hole through a wall. He weighed roughly 40 times what Sarge weighed. Sarge dropped from the ceiling vent onto the hunter's head. What happened next was not graceful or tactical, or anything that a military academy would teach. It was fast and brutal and confusing, and it sounded like a bag of tools being thrown into a blender. And when it was over, the Vithari was on the ground making sounds he had never made before, and Sarge was standing on the hunter's chest with blood on his mouth, most of it not his own. The hunter had managed to hit Sarge with a venomous spur during the fight, a strike that delivered enough toxin to paralyze a creature 4 times Sarge's size. Sarge's body processed the venom the way it processed every other thing the universe threw at it, with contempt. His left shoulder burned, and his muscles twitched, and for about 10 seconds his vision went blurry. And then his immune system did whatever impossible thing honey badger immune systems do, and the venom became nothing more than a bad feeling that made him angrier. Sarge kept moving. He left the hunter behind, and climbed back into the ducts, and followed the smell of his girl through the dark corridors of a ship that had been built by the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. And the ship did not know it yet, but the most dangerous thing aboard was 14 kilograms and covered in fur, and had already decided that every single creature between him and Mara was simply a problem that had not yet been solved. And Sarge was very, very good at solving problems. The first sign that something was wrong aboard the Fang Eternal came as a garbled transmission from a maintenance hunter on the lower deck. The communication officer heard heavy breathing, a wet snarling sound, and then a series of words that did not make any sense. Something about a small furry creature that would not stop biting. And then the transmission cut out. The officer logged it as a communication malfunction and moved on. This was the kind of mistake that people made when they lived in a world where they were always the most dangerous thing in the room. They could not imagine that the danger might be smaller than their hand. Sarge moved through the Fang Eternal like smoke through a cracked window. He was in the ventilation ducts, and then he was in the corridors, and then he was in the ducts again, following the scent of Mara through the maze of the ship. And every time a Vithari stood between him and that scent, the Vithari learned something new about pain. The second hunter Sarge encountered was a weapons specialist heading to the armory. She heard a sound in the duct above her, and looked up just in time to see 14 kilograms of absolute fury drop onto her face. The third was a veteran of 30 hunts across 7 worlds, a hunter with scars on his armor from creatures that would make most species run screaming. He lasted longer than the others, almost a full minute, and when it was over, he lay on the corridor floor with his throat opened by teeth marks so small that the medical team would later struggle to identify what species had made them. None of the hunters managed to send a clear distress signal, because Sarge did not give them time to reach their communicators. He was too fast, too close, and too relentless. And the Vethari combat training, which was designed for fighting large dangerous creatures in open terrain, had absolutely no answer for something that attacked from above, bit through armor gaps, ignored venom, and seemed to have a personal grudge against every living thing that was not a 7-year-old girl. Sarge reached the trophy hall 17 minutes after entering the ship. He found the ventilation grate in the ceiling above Mara's cage, and he began to tear it apart with his claws and teeth. Metal screeching against metal, sparks falling like tiny stars. Mara heard the sound and looked up and saw a small dark shape ripping through the ceiling with a fury that she knew as well as she knew her own name. "Sarge," she whispered. Sarge dropped onto the top of the cage and looked down at her through the transparent ceiling, and his translator collar crackled, and the word that came through was the only word that mattered. "Here." Mara pressed her hand against the ceiling, and Sarge pressed his face against it from the other side, and for one moment they just stayed like that, the girl and the badger. Inches of alien material, together again. Then Sarge went to work on the lock. He attacked the palm print reader with everything he had, biting into the housing, tearing at the wiring. And the mechanism was tough, but Sarge was tougher, because Sarge had been built by a planet that tested everything it made and only kept the things that refused to break. Tala arrived for the routine feeding check and stopped in the doorway of the trophy hall. She saw the honey badger on top of the cage, small, covered in blood and dust, missing a patch of fur from his head, one shoulder swollen from venom, tearing apart a lock mechanism that was rated to withstand assault tools. She saw Mara standing inside the cage, calm and steady, looking at Tala with eyes that held no hatred, but held no submission either. And Mara said, "I told you." Tala stood there for 3 heartbeats. In those 3 heartbeats, she thought about the great hunt and the glory of the goal. Vethari and the Hall of Conquered Meek, and all of the things she had been taught since she was young, that strength was everything, that the strong owned the weak, that the universe was a hunting ground, and the Vethari were its masters. And then she thought about a 7-year-old girl who had not broken in 5 days of captivity, and a 14-kilogram animal that had crossed space with a fractured skull to get her back. And she thought about the note in the xenobiology file. "Do not engage, not worth it, nothing is worth it." And she understood that the note was not a warning about the honey badger. It was a warning about what happened when you got between a human and something they loved. Tala walked to the cage and placed her palm on the lock, and the light turned from blue to green, and the door opened. Mara stepped out. Sarge dropped from the top of the cage and positioned himself between Mara and the rest of the room, between Mara and every shadow, and every doorway, and every possible direction that danger could come from. His translator collar repeated a single word on a loop. "Mine, mine, mine." At that moment the ship shook. The Marine boarding team had reached the secondary bridge and detonated their diversionary charges in the engine compartment. And alarms began to scream throughout the Fang Eternal, and the great warship that had never been breached in 40 years of service was suddenly in chaos. Kravik Dahl received the alert on the command bridge, and his first emotion was not fear or anger, but excitement. Boarders on his ship, finally prey that came to him. He mobilized his hunters and organized them into pursuit packs, and sent them flowing through the corridors of the Fang Eternal to hunt the invaders, and for the first few minutes, everything went according to the traditions of the Great Hunt. Then his hunters began to report problems. The humans were not running. They were shotting, fighting, from fixed positions, using weapons that filled corridors with blinding light and choking gas. And they retreated, only to lead the Vethari into traps. And they fought with a discipline that the Vethari had not expected from the species they had classified as gentle prey. And then the report came from the trophy hall. The human child was free. Something small had broken into the ship and released her. 3 hunters were down in the corridors, 1 dead, 2 unable to explain what had happened to them in any way that made tactical sense. Kravik pulled up the security footage from the lower deck and watched it once and then watched it again. He saw a creature the size of a small bag, furry, 4-legged, bleeding from multiple wounds, attack a fully armored Vethari warrior with 0 hesitation, and 0 fear, and 0 regard for its own survival. He watched the creature take a venomous spur hit that should have caused instant paralysis. Watched the creature get angrier. Kravik had killed things the size of buildings, and he had led hunts on worlds where the very atmosphere was trying to kill him. And he had never once felt uncertain about his place in the universe. He felt uncertain now. He left the command bridge and moved through the ship alone, because this was something the hunt captain had to see for himself. He found them in the main corridor, leading to the docking ring, the girl, the traitor Tala, and the animal. Kravik stood in the corridor and blocked their path, and he was everything the Vethari were supposed to be. Tall, armored, venomous, scarred from 100 victories, the greatest hunter on the greatest hunting ship in the fleet. Sarge stepped forward. Mara put her hand on his back, not to hold him, not to restrain him, just to touch him, to say, "I am here, and you are here, and we are together." "Sarge," she said quietly, "guard." Sarge stopped moving and went completely still. He did not growl. He did not hiss. He did not make any sound at all. He just stood there, 14 kilograms of blood and fury and unbreakable will, and he looked up at Kravik with eyes that held nothing. No fear, no anger, no hesitation, just a flat black promise that said, "I will fight you until one of us is dead. And it will not be me, and even if it is me, I will make you remember this for the rest of your life." Kravik looked at the honey badger. Kravik looked at the child standing behind it. And Kravik understood something that shattered every truth he had ever built his life upon. He was not the apex predator in this corridor. The humans had not evolved away from the monsters of their world. They had walked up to the monsters of their world and said, "You are mine now, and I am yours." And the monsters had said yes. Behind Mara, the sound of boots. The Marine team arriving at a run, weapons up, faces hard. Above them all, the Reclamation locked its weapons onto the Fang Eternal's hull, and Commander Mwangi's voice came through every speaker on the ship. "This is the Terran Defense Force. Release our people, or we will demonstrate what happens when you take a human child from her home." The moment held like a breath between heartbeats. Kravik looked at Sarge one more time. Then the greatest hunter in the Vethari fleet did something he had never done in his entire life. He stepped aside. Mara slept for 11 hours straight when they brought her home. She slept in her own bed in her family's quarters on New Verdana, with her mother on one side and her father on the other, and Sarge curled up against her stomach, his head tucked under her chin, one eye half open, even in sleep, because even now, even safe, even home, he was watching. The colony gathered outside the Okafor Singh home and waited in silence, not because anyone told them to, but because that was what humans did when one of their children came back from the dark. They stood together, and they waited, and they were grateful in a way that went deeper than words. Sarge was in bad shape. The medical team aboard the Reclamation had done what they could during the trip home, but the full list of his injuries was the kind of thing that made veterinarians sit down and breathe slowly before continuing. 4 fractured bones, including the skull plate that had been cracked during the initial abduction and had gotten worse during every fight afterward. Venom scarring across his left shoulder, where the tissue had died and regrown again, as his body fought off toxins that should have killed him 3 times over. Dozens of lacerations across his body, some deep enough to show muscle. A cracked canine tooth from biting through a Vathari armor plate. Internal bruising that the scanner showed as a dark map of violence spread across his small frame. The xenobiologist who compiled the report added a note at the bottom that simply said, "Pain response indicators confirm the subject was fully conscious and experiencing significant pain throughout all engagements. The subject's behavior was not the result of an inability to feel pain, but rather a complete refusal to be stopped by it." Sarge spent 4 days in the Colony Medical Center, which was 3 days longer than he wanted, because on the first day, he tried to leave, and had to be convinced to stay by Mara sitting next to his bed, and reading him her school reports about soil microbes, which was either very boring or very soothing, because Sarge closed his eyes and stayed. Commander Mwangi filed her after-action report, and marked it as Priority 1, and sent it up through every channel she had access to. The report reached the Terran Defense Force High Command within a day. It reached the Galactic Interspecies Classification Bureau within a week, and then things got very interesting. The Vathari demanded that the incident be classified as mutual combat between equal parties, because the alternative was admitting that their greatest warship had been boarded by 5 humans and 1 small mammal, and that the small mammal had done more damage than the other 5 combined. The Terran Diplomatic Corps rejected this, and filed a formal complaint that included the security footage from the Fang Eternal, footage that showed a 7-year-old girl in a cage, and a honey badger fighting through a ship of apex predators to reach her. The footage was not classified. It spread across the galactic communication networks within hours. 17 billion sentient beings across 400 worlds watched a 14-kilogram Earth animal attack a Vathari hunter 3 times its height, and refused to stop, even after being poisoned, struck, and thrown against a wall. The footage became the most viewed media file in galactic history within 3 days. Tala, the young Vathari sub-hunter who had opened Mara's cage, formally requested asylum with the Terran Defense Force, and was granted it. She provided testimony about the Vathari's trophy hunting practices, detailed records of dozens of species that had been captured from their homeworlds and imprisoned in the Hall of Conquered Meek, many of them sentient, many of them taken as children, because children were easier to transport and less likely to fight. Testimony was broadcast across the same networks that had carried the footage of Sarge, and the combination of the two, the testimony and the video, hit the galactic community like a hammer. 14 species filed formal protests against the Vathari. 6 species recalled their ambassadors. The Vathari fleet pulled back to their home systems and went very quiet. The Galactic Interspecies Classification Bureau, the body responsible for assigning every known species a threat ranking based on their biology, behavior, and combat capability, convened an emergency session to address what they called the human question. The question was simple: should humanity be reclassified? For the past 30 years, humans had been listed as Meek Class Opportunistic Omnivore, a designation that meant in plain terms, not dangerous, not interesting, not a threat. The emergency session was held in the Bureau's central chamber on the neutral station of Calyx Prime, with representatives from over 200 species in attendance. The Terran ambassador was a woman named Dr. Adaizi Okonkwo, who was tall and calm and spoke with the kind of quiet precision that made people lean forward to listen. She did not talk about warships, She did not talk about weapons or armies or the size of humanity's fleet. She presented a single piece of evidence. She put the biological profile of Mellivora capensis on the main display. A honey badger, shown in full detail, with annotations covering its resistance to venom, its thick loose skin, its powerful bite, its documented history of attacking lions, fighting cobras, raiding beehives, despite being stung hundreds of times, and engaging in combat for hours after sustaining injuries that would kill most species instantly. Then she showed a photograph of a human child, not Mara, but a child from Earth, sitting in a garden with a honey badger asleep in her lap. And she said, "This is what we are. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy, and we are not the fastest, and we are not the most heavily armed. We are the species that looked at this animal, an animal that fights everything, fears nothing, and has survived for 60 million years on the most dangerous planet in this sector. And we said, that one, I want that one to protect my children." She paused, and then she said, "We did the same with wolves and made them into dogs. We did it with horses, with hawks, with elephants. We find the most dangerous things on our world, and we do not run from them. We walk toward them, and we offer them our trust. And they give us their loyalty, and together we become something that neither of us could be alone." She looked around the chamber at 200 species, many of whom had claws and venom and armor and psychic abilities, and she said, "You have been classifying us as meek because we are soft, but our softness is not weakness. Our softness is what lets us bond, and our bonds are what make us dangerous." The chamber was silent. The Bureau voted. Humanity was not reclassified as a predator species because that was not what they were. They were given a new classification, one that had never existed before in the Bureau's 12,000-year history. The official designation read, Bonded Apex, meek form entities capable of forming permanent symbiotic combat relationships with organisms significantly exceeding their own threat classification. Do not engage the individual, do not engage the bonded, do not assume you have identified all bonded organisms in the area. The classification included a footnote, added at the request of Dr. Okonkwo, with a small smile. See attached, partial list of Terran bonded species. Note that Mellivora capensis is not the most dangerous animal on their world. It is simply the most stubborn. On New Verdana, life returned to something like normal. Mara went back to school and finished her soul microbe project, and received the highest grade in her class, which surprised no one, because the girl who had survived 5 days on a Vithari warship was not going to be defeated by homework. She gave a presentation about her experience to the colony's children, and when one of the younger kids asked if she had been scared, she said, "Yes, I was very scared every single day, but I had Sarge, and Sarge never gave up, so I decided I would not give up either." Sarge sat beside her during the presentation, and yawned once, and then fell asleep, which was his review of public speaking. Tala settled on New Verdana as the colony's first Vithari resident, and took a job helping with the perimeter security systems. And sometimes she sat with Mara in the evenings, and they talked about the stars, and about the difference between hunting and protecting, and about the strange and wonderful idea come from caring about something more than you cared about yourself. One evening, 6 months after Mara came home, a new ship appeared in orbit above New Verdana. It was a diplomatic vessel from a species called the Relkathi, gentle, curious, four-armed beings who had never contacted humanity before. They sent a single transmission to the colony, and the transmission said, "We wish to open trade relations. We have read the reclassification. We have one question. How does one acquire a dog?" Mara was sitting in the dirt outside the perimeter when the message was read over the colony's speakers, collecting soil samples for another school project, because the first one had been interrupted, and she intended to finish what she started. Sarge was beside her, half asleep in the late afternoon sun, one ear twitching at sounds that no one else could hear. Mara scratched him behind the ear, and he made a low rumbling sound that his translator collar did not bother to convert, because some sounds did not need translation. They sat together in the red dirt of a world far from Earth, a girl and a honey badger, soft and small and completely unbreakable. And somewhere across the galaxy, in the silent halls of the Fang Eternal, the Vathari looked at their trophies and their mounted kills and their records of 1,000 hunts, and for the first time in their long and bloody history, they wondered if they had been wrong about what it meant to be strong. And on 200 worlds, species that had never thought much about the soft little newcomers from that unremarkable planet in the Orion Arm, read the new classification and looked at the footage and learned a truth that the Vathari had learned the hard way. Do not take their children, do not threaten their bonds, and whatever you do, do not ignore the small angry creature standing between you and the thing it loves, because it will not stop. Stop. And by the time you understand why, it will already be too late.